sectors of the economy and over society as a whole, so that society itself industrialized and adopted the qualities of industry, its mechanization, but also its temporalities, its divisions of the working day, its precise temporal divisions, its clock time, etc., its discipline, its wage relations. All of these aspects of industrial production for 150 years were imposed over other sectors of the economy and over society as a whole. So our argument is that today, like that part seems to me relatively uncontroversial. I guess also uncontroversial is the notion that industry no longer plays that central role in the economy. It's not that there are fewer people in the factory today. No, there are probably more people in the factory today than 20 years ago. But I think it's clear that the industrial production is no longer the pinnacle of the capitalist economy, and moreover, it's no longer imposing its qualities over other forms of economic production and over society as a whole. That also, I think, is relatively uncontroversial. The controversial part, and the part that might be wrong, but we're convinced we're right. I mean, that's the problem of writing together too. Like, I think it's right, Tony thinks it's right, it must be right, because we're both, So anyway, the more controversial part is to say, well, what has taken the place of industry as the hegemonic or dominant sector of the capitalist economy? And we hypothesize that what we often call immaterial production, we sometimes call biopolitical production, is taking this central role. And by that we mean the production of goods or products that are in large part immaterial, like the production of ideas, the production of knowledges, information, code, but also the production of affects. I mean, it's not just a question of, the French often call this cognitive labor, which doesn't seem to me the right term. And then they talk about the new cognitariat, a very awkward term. But I think that it's been useful for me to link these reflections on that sector with a tradition that really comes from US and British socialist feminist tradition about recognizing affect as within the realm of production. In other words, I mean, it starts in a way with these rather unsuccessful so-called debates on domestic labor within socialist feminists in Britain and the US in the 1970s and 80s, and then develops into terms such as caring work or kin work, trying to recognize production of affects, emotional labor, as work and as forms of exploitation relating to alienation, so that this allows you to recognize not only software programmers, etc., but also in a variety of service industries, in healthcare, in education. Flight attendants is a classic example from the Arlie Hochschild book, which I think was published, about the way flight attendants, for instance, they do, of course, many material tasks, safety things. I don't know exactly what they do, like the material things, but a lot of what flight attendants do is a kind of emotional work, affective work. They're nice to people who are jerks. I mean, that's what it is to be with people who are on airplanes who have missed their flights. And it's a highly gendered sector. I mean, this affective production remains highly gendered. Legal assistance is a similar way, but also in healthcare. I mean, what nurses do, or any healthcare professional, educators too, is you do some material tasks, but a lot of it is the production of a sense of well-being, etc. So this is what we're trying to link here by this term immaterial, or better, the term biopolitical, because what's really being produced when we're producing ideas and knowledges and code and affects, what's really being produced are forms of life. And that's why, hence the term biopolitical, the production of forms of life. So the claim is that as industry was central in the capitalist economy in a previous era, our claim is that this biopolitical production, or immaterial production, is becoming central in our current economy, and carrying with it new qualities that are being imposed over other forms of industry and over society as a whole. For instance, industry now has to informationalize. It has to become more image-oriented. Affects are playing new roles within different parts of the economy as part of the centers of profit and wage labor, and that the qualities of this immaterial production are progressively being imposed. Like one way is to see that in terms of temporality. I mean, like I said, one of the divisions of time and time discipline was the working day that the factory, in a way, generalized. And one of the things we see today is a breakdown of the working day at a variety of points of the economy. For instance, at the high end of the economy, you probably know about these campuses, they call them, like the Google campus in California or the Microsoft campus near Seattle. They have the workers there at Microsoft and at Google, and they have really incredible things they can do. They have a gymnasium, you can have massage, you can eat there, you can sleep there, anything to keep you there and working. I mean, there's a complete indistinction between work time and non-work time, which might sound like paradise if you haven't experienced it, but it can soon seem like a horrifying idea. This lack of distinction between the breakdown of the working day and a lack of distinction between work time and non-work time. Right, since I mentioned that before, it of course reminds me again of the socialist feminist theories of the 1980s, which similarly was talking about the lack of the working day. I mean, partly the discussion of the double day of women's labor is already part of this, but there too, in a way that is becoming generalized. Or rather, at lower ends of the economy, you can see how what we or many call precarious work also involves a breakdown of the working day, where you might wait tables at noon and sit as a security guard in the evening and then clean offices at the night. There too, there's a breakdown of the working day. All of this just a temporal example for the ways in which the qualities of, it's no longer the qualities of industrial production, but rather the qualities of what I'm calling biopolitical or immaterial production are becoming generalized. Now, one point about this, so in this biopolitical or immaterial production, what I'm saying is that the primary products are or tend to be common. It's not that the ideas or even affect can't be ruled by private property. They can be sometimes. Part of the claim is really that it's increasingly difficult to do so, to control music as private property, to control ideas as private property. It's difficult, that's one thing. But the second is that they lose their productivity when they are made private property, when they're no longer common. They're most productive when they're common. The open source people often talk about internet information that way. You can see it easily in the realm of ideas. You can think about scientific communities and the need for open access to ideas for the ideas to be productive. Think too again about affects. I mean, you can certainly produce affects under command. I mean, that's what service work is all about. I mean, if you work in service work, you are producing affects under command. You're selling your ability to be friendly. You're selling your ability to love sometimes. But you can produce affects under command, but they're greatly reduced, it seems to me, quite obvious, from the kinds of production of affects that one can imagine outside of that relations of command. So my point in general, this is a point very much like Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto, is that the relations of property today with the new forms of production are becoming increasingly fetters or obstacles to productivity. It's a strange kind of argument. Well, maybe it's not strange if you read the Communist Manifesto too often, like I do. But that's the kind of that's the way to figure this. Now, sometimes these two forms of the common coincide. I mean, as you can probably imagine, Tony and I have spent more time thinking about this second form of the common, the ideas and affects and code and images. But I've become increasingly interested, also since the publication of this book, in the relationship between the two, between that notion of the common and the common in terms of the earth and the atmosphere and the water. There's sometimes in which, of course, they coincide, like, I was thinking of the so-called cases of biopiracy that's often discussed in Brazil or in India. It's often the case, what's a typical example is the result of an indigenous community's knowledge. And an indigenous community's knowledge that's not produced by one person, but that's produced in the community over a long